Welcome to Volume 8 in the series, South Pender Pioneer Families, with Rachel Epstein. This series is dedicated to learning about the unique and important history of South Pender Pioneer families and their connection to SDÁYES, South Pender Island, and the surrounding Salish Sea. Rachel was introduced to South Pender Island by her parents when she came to visit when she was a young girl. During those visits at that early age, she met Eve and John Smith, two very prominent locals living on South Pender Island. Eve had a particularly strong influence on Rachel, and as she got older, she was able to get a Canada Council grant so she could interview Eve Smith with audio recordings, which she planned to later turn into a book about Eve. Although the book never came to fruition, it was a very impactful experience on Rachel to do those recordings with Eve. Rachel will recount her memories about being on Pender Island during those years, describe some of the pivotal experiences she had along the way, and share how important South Pender is to her. That and so much more. This recording was made in June of 2025 on South Pender Island, and is made possible with grants administered by the South Pender Island Historical Society. I'm your host, Chris Wakaluk, and it's my pleasure to present this series to you. My voice has been extracted from this final recording to give maximum time and clarity for the interviewee to share their stories. Thank you for listening. Now here is Rachel Epstein, sharing her story about her connection to South Pender Island.
So my name is Rachel Epstein. I have a very long-standing relationship to Pender Island, particularly South Pender Island, and in particular to Eve Smith. So I'm going to share some of my memories of Eve. So I met Eve through my parents, Norman Epstein and Marilyn Epstein, although my mother later changed her name to Marilyn Golub after they separated. They moved to Vancouver from New York and Montreal in 1959, and I think shortly after that met Eve. And at that point, Eve was involved with a man named Don Smith, and also Doug Cameron was part of that grouping. And they were all involved in left-wing politics in Vancouver, and in particular the CCF, which was the forerunner to the NDP. So I think Eve and John were amongst the early people that my parents met when they came to Vancouver. And I don't know exactly the dates, but at some point, Eve ended the relationship with Don Smith and got involved with his brother, John Smith. And then Eve, who had the early connection to the island, right? Because Eve was a Gray. Eve's name before she was with Don Smith was Eve Gray. And the Gray family, I believe, has a long history on the island. And I did, I'll talk about it a bit more, but I did eventually do a whole series of interviews with Eve where she told me all that history and her family's history with the island. And that's captured in those interviews, and it's in the transcripts of the interviews. My memory at this point, I don't remember all of what she told me of that the history of her family. But I know that when Eve was no longer with Don and then got together with John, and then Eve and John lived for many, many, many years on Gowland Point Road, almost at Brooks Point, in a little log cabin, a very beautiful log cabin right down by the water. And they had two ponies named Pico and Cheyenne. So as a kid, I would come over with my family, with my parents and my brothers, and we would stay at what was then Bedwell Harbor Resort, and which looked very different at the time. It was just little wooden cabins, very kind of modest wooden cabins. And we would stay there, and then we would walk from Bedwell Harbor down to Eve and John's, which would be, I don't know, maybe like a half-hour walk, something like that. And we would go and visit them, and we would, go and sit in the cabin, but we would also ride the ponies. So we would ride the ponies all over the point, and Eve would just kind of put us on the ponies. I think I have photographs somewhere of me and others on the ponies. And I remember that Eve would go swimming every single day, admirably. And I remember once we didn't have bathing suits. I think we wanted to swim maybe, but we didn't have bathing suits. And John was just like, you don't need bathing suits, just like go naked, right? Like, and I was like a bit shocked by this idea. I don't know if I was a teenager then, maybe like 9 or 10, something like that. But the idea of just going naked was, so they were kind of ahead of their time, even John, like politically and just kind of lifestyle-y. And I think I was a bit like fascinated by them. Like they were just such interesting people. And their house was filled with books and papers. Eve was constantly writing, thinking, reading. She was very, very involved politically, particularly as an environmentalist. And she had very strong views about the environment and how we should be living and what we should be doing and not doing. And she was very vocal and very prolific in writing. So she would write articles, she would write letters to the editor. She was always doing something to make the world a better place. I remember she was very opposed to fluoride in the water at the time. I guess maybe that was the beginnings of the fluoridization, I guess, of water. She was opposed to that. She had strong opinions about things. And I remember her telling my mother often, like, what we should or what she should and shouldn't be doing. And John was sort of quieter, slightly intimidating. I remember always feeling slightly intimidated by John. He seemed like he would sit in his armchair and always be reading. Both of them were very knowledgeable, very well read, very interesting people. And I would think I was both fascinated and maybe slightly intimidated by both of them. John had an amazing garden and spent a lot of his time gardening. Like that was one of his passions anyway, was his garden. And I know that every year he would enter, particular vegetables in the fair, in the Pender Fair, and often won like first prize for, I don't remember what particular prizes he won, but he won a lot of prizes at the Pender Island Fair. And partly I just remember like the smells of this island are very vivid to me. Like there's something about the evergreen trees and there's something about the moss. And in particular, like I have like all my favorite places on the island. Usually what I do when I come here is I just go to all my favorite places. And one of them was Roseland. There used to be a series of little wooden cabins that go out onto the peninsula there at Roseland. And I used to stay always in number 9, which was pretty much the first one. It was little and it was the first one, I think, when you start walking out. And there's a particular moss in that area that has this really amazing smell. And I remember I came here once with my kid and their partner as adults. And we were all going like, what's that smell? What's that smell? What is it? And then by the end, we were like down on the ground, smelling things, trying to figure out like, what is the smell? And then I realized it's this moss, it's this particular moss. But it's just generally I have very strong memories of the smells of Pender, very positive memories. Yeah. So I would go to Roseland. I would go to the Spit. Mortimer Spit is what you're calling the Spit, right? Yeah, I'd go there. I would do that hike up to Greenburn Lake. I would hike up Mount Norman. Of course, Brooks Point. I would spend a lot of time there. There's also a place behind Port Washington. If you go to Port Washington and you go up the road behind Port Washington, and then you kind of scramble up a very, 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 very big hill, and you get the most incredible view of kind of all the islands and the ferries and everything. I would go up there. I mean, you can probably get up there with a trail too. I would just always scramble up. And Yeah, I had some very meaningful moments, often by myself. I spent a lot of time by myself on the island. I had some very meaningful moments on the top of that hill of just sort of doing my own kind of self-reflection. I also have memories as a kid of picking blackberries right across from the Driftwood Center. Like there was a whole row of blackberries there. And just blackberries in general, they seemed to be very prolific on the island. And we did a lot of blackberry picking and baking with them and stuff like that. But mostly I guess a lot of my memory of Pender is walking. Like I walk a lot on the island. I just love walking and the stillness and the smells and the birds and the wildlife and the beauty. It's just so beautiful. I feel like even now there's not that many cars. I mean, there's mostly it's cars going to Brooks Point. Like if you're driving on South Pender, either you live there and you're going to where you live, or you're going to visit Brooks Point. And I think it's really awesome that they saved Brooks Point, and I know that the Petries and others were very involved in that campaign to save it and preserve it. And it's just such a beautiful place. Again, I don't remember a lot of details. It would be in the interviews that I did. I'm sure we talked about the things that she wrote, but I just remember her constantly clipping things from newspapers, and she had a lot of papers and things that she would keep and little notes written on little scraps of paper and things like. And she was very frequently published, like letters to the editor. She was writing all the time. And probably a lot in Victoria papers is my guess. I mean, I'm sure she wrote also for Gulf Island publications, but probably particularly Victoria. And then in 1984, I got a Canada Council explorations grant because I was really interested in Eve and finding out more about her life and all of that. And so I got a Canada Council grant to interview her and potentially write a book. That was my plan, was to interview Eve and write a book about her and her life. So at the time I was working at Press Gang Printers and Publishers, which was like a feminist-run printing shop and publishing company. And I left that job because I got this grant and I came over to South Pender. So Eve lives very close to Brooks Point, and then she also had access, and I don't remember exactly the story of it, but there was a little wood cabin at the foot of Higgs Road, just off to the right, and with no electricity, just a wood stove. And I was able to stay there. So I was staying there, and I brought over my IBM Selectric typewriter, which was the thing I had spent the most money on. I had never spent as much money on anything. I think I spent $1,000, and this was like 1984 for this typewriter. It was very cherished, and I got a very, 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 very long extension cord and plugged into the house up the way up on Higgs Road so that I could have electricity. So I'd sit there under the kerosene lamp, typing on my IBM Selectric and transcribing the interviews that I did. So every morning I would walk around the bay on the beach to Eve's house, and Eve had a bedroom that looked right out over the water. And I would interview her about her life, about her family's early history on the island, and then about her life in Vancouver and her life with Dawn, and then her life with John, and her politics and friendships and everything. And so I did that for several weeks for sure. And we were still in the middle of that process. And then Eve got ill because she had TB as a child and had spent some time, I think quite a bit of time, in what was called then a TB sanatorium. So somewhere where you went when you had TB. And as a result of that, her lungs were weak. And so I believe that was what happened, that she got some illness, lung-related illness. And I ended up taking her to the hospital in Victoria. And I don't believe that she ever fully recovered from that. And I don't recall right at this moment when she died, but she died not too long after that, I believe. And then John kept living there in that cabin for a number of years until he passed away. And now I believe it's Eve's niece who is living there. And I think has rebuilt the house, but it's the same layout. It's like, I think she kept the same layout as their log house, because it was a lovely house, and it was like a living room with a kitchen beside it, sort of attached. And then I think just a couple of rooms as well. And I'm pretty sure she kept the same layout of the house, even though it's rebuilt, like it's new. She was so fervent about her politics, and particularly about environmental issues. And, not a lot of people at that time were talking about the environment. And she had really strong opinions. And she was just such a character. Like she had a really strong personality, really interesting and different, and so ferocious, fervent. I don't know what you would say about her. So full of opinions and beliefs and values, right? And she was really living her values, right? Like she, was, I think, trying to live as consistently with her values as she could. And I just found her interesting. Yeah, kind of fascinating. And I thought someone should write about her. And then eventually, as I never did write that book. My life changed. I moved from Vancouver to Toronto just shortly after that. But there was this big, huge pile of transcripts. And then eventually a guy named Vic Cathers, I think that's his last name, Cathers, Cathers, did write a book about Eve. And it's called Beloved Dissident. And he used my material, those transcripts of those interviews. He used that in part, as a source for his book. So I was very, very glad that eventually somebody did do that, and that those interviews and that material, and it ended up being useful to him. She was quite fine for me to come over every day with my tape recorder and talk to her. But I do remember she was somewhat reluctant to talk about her personal life. She didn't go into, I think I was digging for the juice, right? And she was reluctant to talk too much about her personal life. She kept it mostly her politics, her beliefs, things she felt were important. That was what she really wanted to talk about. She got ill in the middle of it, and so we got interrupted. So we weren't quite finished. There was, it was an unfinished project. I've come back like so many times. Like I always come back, and stayed lots of different places on the island. I have stayed both on north and south. I prefer south if I can, and I have done. I did a lot of house sitting on South Pender in particular. I've house sit for the Petries, often I'm taking care of dogs and cats. And I house sat for the woman who ran Art on the Fence, and also house sat also somewhere just down off of Brooks Point, some friends of the Petries, artists. I camped at the campground on North Pender. Like I say, I stayed at Roseland many times. There was another kind of rental-y, resort-y place whose name I can't remember, that had a hot tub outside. Stayed there. Stayed lots and lots of different places. I've had friends who have had places that they've let me use. And now I have friends who have a yurt on South Pender. So I come and I stay on a very lovely yurt on South Pender. And as I say, I just go from favorite place to favorite place. I have my kind of list of where I need to go when I'm on Pender. And I go there and sometimes hike up to Greenburn Lake, and used to swim there. Last time I went, it wasn't so swimmable. It looked like it was kind of covered with some kind of muck. But sometimes it was beautiful. Like it was a beautiful, beautiful swimming up there. I've also hiked into Buck Lake and Roe Lake and figured out ways to access both of those lakes. Well, at that time, the ferry came to Port Washington. So we would take the ferry to Port Washington. I have very vivid memories of the store at Port Washington, like the general store, and how it was such a great place to go because it had so many interesting things in it. It had everything, but nothing particular stands out, really. I have very vivid memories of that walk from Bedwell Harbor to even John's place. That big, huge rock, that mammoth rock that has been there forever, and God knows how it got here. And the ponies. Feels that's what we would do. We would go there. We would walk on the road to Eve and John's, visit them, sometimes swim, ride the ponies. Yeah, I would say this is one of my favorite places in the world. I guess I have memories also of, I used to go to the fire hall and so the women of South Pender in particular, I think, would gather at the fire hall and do yoga. And I would often join them. I guess at various times when I've spent longer periods, like if I'm doing like a house sit for a few weeks or a month or whatever, I would go to the fire hall and do yoga there. And I would also go down to what then became Poets Cove, and the women down there were doing aquafit. And so we would all do aquafit in the pool and then go sit in the hot tub. And we were just down there today, actually, in the pool, and with that beautiful view out over Bedwell Harbor. And we went there last night to watch the sunset. And I have a funny memory of coming here with someone I was partnered with at the time. Come here with various partners. But we were coming over to Pender Island, and I was trying to convince them that they should love the music of Farron. Farron was initially Vancouver-based, now lives on Saturna, as far as I understand, and became quite a famous queer folk singer, and has a big following. And I was trying to convince my friend that how great Farron's music was, and how it was, that she should be a fan of Farron. And we arrived on Pender, and the first thing we saw when we came off the island was a sign that said, "Farron, tonight." And we went, and Farron gave this amazing concert in the community hall on North Pender. And it was just one of those, like, wow, I can't believe that happened. The other thing I remember thinking about is that always struck me about Pender was the arbutus trees, and particularly like right up from Bedwell Harbor. You go around the corner, and then there's a little place you can go in, and you can kind of be up top above the harbor, and the arbutus trees up there are so beautiful.
Thank you very much to Rachel for doing that interview. This interview and the entire series has been made possible with funding from the Capital Regional District, the Pender Island Community Resource Center, the W SÁNEĆ Leadership Council, W SÁNEĆ School Board, the Pender Islands Museum, and the South Pender Historical Society. Thank you to all these organizations for contributing to make these recordings possible.